oligarch sanctions changing quite a bit. I mean, not that too much is going on because they are not the biggest concern of the international sanction policies in general, but also certainly not when it comes to actually sanctioning oligarchs. The figures have been changing quite a bit. Before we get them, I'll show you the latest figures of this year. In March, the Forbes list, American and international Forbes list, was released, and on there were already the Russian oligarchs listed. There is a separate list, almost overlapping, Forbes Russia. Whenever I say Forbes Russia, everybody says right away, certainly all fake. Forbes Russia is a very good, now it's going downhill, of course, because nobody can say anything anymore, but it's one of the few outlets that used to make proper journalism in Russia. So it's not our stereotyping here true in that case. Bit ironic. There are also a few years ago when there were censorship attempts, interventions from higher up, went on strike against them. Collective actions in a media outlet in Russia is a rarity, but they went for it. Now the best people, they are leaving because they can't do anything much on the workplace. So, no, we shouldn't be here. Let's see. During the year, there were once in a while news coming out how much the oligarchs are losing because of the sanctions, because of the whole war situation. Of course, there were also a whole range of properties, but by the end of the year, we can see that they've done pretty well. Sorry, this is that. So we've got 110 billionaires in Russia on the Russian Forbes list. Last year it was April. Last year it was 88. So we've got a good few more billionaires than there used to be. And their wealth, their overall wealth, has also increased quite a bit from 350 billion to over 500 billion, and obviously also their average wealth. The US list would have had 115 billionaires listed, but 5 of them, in an attempt to escape sanctions, gave up their Russian citizenship. Among the sanctioned oligarchs in this group, there are just under 50, and the top 20, there are now 15 oligarchs who are under sanction. That is a new development. For long, not even half of the top 20 were on any sanction list. When I say sanction list, what I mean is the major sanction lists, the US list, the EU list, and the UK list. Australia and Canada have been better in some areas, but if it's only Australia, it's a bit meager. They're a little bit on their own. So whenever I talk sanction lists, I mean major sanction lists, EU, UK, and US. So go back here. No, that's not what I want. So the biggest winners go first along the Forbes list. This year, number 1 is Andrei Melnichenko. I say a few more words about him. He was on position 9 last year, and he's someone who is absolutely convinced that he should not be on any sanction list, and he's doing making a lot of efforts for that to happen. Then we have Vladimir Potanin. Vladimir Potanin has long been on position 1 or several years, time and again. He is, whenever you open a textbook about the 1990 Russia, not even one about wealth or oligarchs, he will play a central role. He was the one who was in 1995 designed, engineered the loans for share auctions. That is one, it was very scandalous, very corrupt. He, of course, also decided in a way that he would not be losing out. And that is basically often seen as the birth hour of the oligarchs. We saw later in the 1990s. Subsequently, they took over basically the oligarch capture of the state when they tried to have Boris Yeltsin re-elected. His popularity rates were 4%, and he faced a very popular communist leader, Zyuganov, who was meant to win, and state started financed a propaganda campaign that turned things round. And then we have Vladimir Lysin. You will probably never have heard of him. He was leading the 2022 Forbes list and is on no single sanction list of the major ones only. I think it's Australia. So if you look a bit closer to them, Potanin was not on a sanction list for economic reasons, for the fear that he controls 14% of the global metal and nickel market, that it would cause waves, shock waves through the global market in this area. It wasn't in his case so much that his reputation laundering from before had turned him in such kind of a darling of the West, who cannot be any kind of the exception, the good oligarch, but he was very clever in how he got into, especially the US elites. He was one of the first who got, or maybe even the only one, who became a trustee of the Guggenheim Museum and got into all kind of important, not so much in the UK, not like Blavatnik here, into important elite positions. Finally, in December last year, the US added him to the list. Of course, there was criticism around it that he should actually be there. He's also one of the biggest winners of the war. It doesn't show that much in his wealth. He was on position 2 last year and obviously moved 1 down. Oh no, still in position 2, otherwise, yeah, he wouldn't be in the middle. He was in many cases the one when in situations when Western companies were leaving Russia because of sanctions, and Putin had cake pieces to distribute among the most loyal oligarchs. He would get the biggest piece of them. So, for example, you might have heard of Tinkoff, Oleg Tinkoff. Oleg Tinkoff had to steer the bank, Tinkoff Bank, and he had to sell it. He expressed his criticism. He already was in London. He was here, he had leukemia and was treated here and also lives here, has lived here for a while. And he was forced to sell his bank for a bargain price, and Potanin was the one chosen to buy it off him. Lysin is the one who was last year on position on number 1, missing everywhere, which is Europe has an e-missing, which is a bizarre thing. He's maybe it was because he kept such a low profile throughout. Has anybody ever heard the name? Because except Lysin is a long-term, he's been around forever. He's very close to Putin. He owns a steel empire, And he, of course, because he's not sanctioned, can export to, especially in the EU, where his products, steel, is bought of him. He was, of course, that was for the EU a big criteria. Those oligarchs who on the 24th of February came to the Kremlin to a meeting, Putin invited them to, he was one among them. There were about 3 dozens, and that was kind of one of the main criteria. They as a bulk should be sanctioned. Doesn't mean that they actually got sanctioned. But most cases it was when they didn't get sanctioned because they were just too important for the European economies. Just a kind of this kind of there was at least like with Bhutan some reason that goes beyond just forgetting about them for some odd reason. But in Listin's case, it's still quite astonishing because he manufactures directly for the weapon industry. Steel is used very much to build tanks, missiles, drones, and so on. He also has very close links to the nuclear industry in Russia. So you would mean that he should actually be quite a priority in terms of sanctioning. Why he wasn't sanctioned, there's a bizarre reason. Belgium must have the best lobbyists in the world. They vetoed it in the EU and got through with it. There is a company is kind of often portrayed that it would be an absolute catastrophe for Belgium and other countries in terms of the unemployment that would cause. The factory in Belgium employs 1,200 people. And then finally, Melnichenko, who got a good deal out of this year, more than doubling his wealth, now #1. He was one, he always quite clever in how he engineered his image. Always a little bit an outsider, not so much photographed with Putin. I couldn't even find a photograph with Putin. The person behind him is Mordashov. Mordashov does all kinds of things. For years been among the first, certainly the first 10. And he's in diamond industry in the African continent, in all kinds of different areas. And nevertheless, yeah, Melnichenko, some bizarre story. He's also convinced, obviously, he shouldn't be on the list. What he did was on the 8th of March was to sell all his shares from the shares in his company and wrote them into the name of his wife. His wife has a European passport, European Union passport from was it Croatia, and that way he thought he'd get not sanctioned. I not sanctioned, but his wife certainly not. The next day, a sanction package came out. He was on there, and then at some point, the EU figured out, or maybe it's just writing in all his shares over to his wife is a little meager, and sanctioned her too. And since then, Melnichenko is fighting, challenging this decision in court. What is bizarre around him? I got a call some time ago from a journalist from the Zeit, an investigative journalist. The Zeit, quite a decent newspaper. And so what he said about Melnichenko is his charm is just mind-blowing. Everybody falls for it when they've met him. So it seemed a little bit this journalist. And she was, it happened that, so he wrote a column, an op-ed, which is sent to the Zeit, was intended to improve his reputation. And they replied, no, they can't just print an op-ed. but they are happy to do an interview with him. And the interview obviously painted him very good light. And then it turned out in the end that he's nevertheless forgotten some bits in his biography when talking to the journalist. It's quite a courageous man. He is sometimes even he's got some success in the people say he's an exceptional one who is one of the good oligarchs. Nevertheless, he not only attended that meeting on the 24th of February in 2022, but also others didn't, of the big names. He also met Putin during an annual meeting of what's called the Business Union in March 2023. He explains it best that he's got responsibility and he is certainly not one who would just back down when he has taken on such responsibility. Here we have the big three cases of quite the first two are quite skilled in their reputation management. And especially the story of Abramovich is quite a telling one. Dasha Zhukova is his ex-wife, remarried, and the two at the end, Michael Friedman and Piotr Aven, you might know, they were the ones who gave interviews in March last year, I believe. One was the Times, the other one, no, Financial Times, the other one, I can't remember, where they tried to get sympathy, talking about that they are now in a situation where they can't afford any cleaner anymore, or they don't know how to pay their cleaner, and they don't know how to pay their drivers. It kicked and didn't get down so well, except in the UK, I noticed. At the time I got a lot of phone calls from both European journalists and British ones, and the British ones tended to even they couldn't understand why on earth Friedman should be on the sanction list. They didn't know so much about Armine, even so Armine is the one who has been building his reputation for years. I was one of the first ones who I was still in Austria, it must have been early 2000s, who you could see on all kind of documentaries showing and talking about his art collection. And he seems to be the kind of more erudite, sophisticated one among them. But yeah, Friedman here in this country worked in many cases that he spoke out as the one who is not fair to be sanctioned. So more about Abramovich. Abramovich was very clever. He started on the 4th of February, knowing that there's something likely to come, to rearrange his assets that hadn't yet parked safely offshore. He has a lot of the trusts in West Jersey and other offshore places, but to keep them totally safe, what he did, 10 trusts, 8 of them he fully wrote over to his 7 children. It's true, this I guess that can be the figure much higher, but what was found out is that's minimum 4 billion. That was all found by the Guardian, the oligarch leaks that are called. He was finished with the process by the day of the invasion on 24th of February. It's now kind of a discussion around, can that be legal or not? Difficult because right from the start, it was only the US who was a little bit more resolute and sanctioning not only the main breadwinners, but also their family members and then contemplated extending it not only to them, but wider family, plus mistresses, and maybe also business partners they're close to. Once the war started, Abramovich, it was also interesting here in this country, on the 22nd of February, Johnson announced the first international sanctions. On the sanction list here were 3 names, Timchenko, Rothenberg. You would think that there was a certain choice here in this country, given how many live here, to find some names of people who live here, a bigger interest here. Timchenko, Rothenberg are not among them. They have some flats and houses, but their main interests are in Finland, in Switzerland, in France. So basically, Johnson chose 3 names who would not really be so destroyed and despaired about being on the list. He tried also for a long time to save, at least 2 weeks, he tried to save Abramovich. Abramovich is said to be the oligarch, the Russian oligarch, who is the most accepted and respected among the UK establishment. But it was clear that in every country who is the opposition or in general public wants the one brought to the altar, they know, and that is in this country, obviously, Abramovich. He is not on the US sanction list. He did a very smart move. He positioned himself as a potential mediator in the peace talks and negotiations, and succeeded. It is said that Zelensky himself made a plea to the American authorities to not put him on the sanction list. Abramovich is a genius when it comes to reinventing himself. He's done so several times. First, when he bought Chelsea, and in response to that, many in the public, especially Chelsea supporters, would not want to be him being talked about in a negative way. The Roman Empire and the Roman Emperor. Now it's kind of an interesting process going on here. I met 2 journalists from the Le Monde last week. They're doing a 6-part series on Abramovich. And I noticed right at the beginning, the first of them was when I met them, kind of maybe 30 years old, a little bit of hipster type, certainly left-wing views. And he said things that they don't have a Russian background. So it's not that they worked on Russian oligarchs for a long time. And he said something that was strange. Abramovich is the one who employs only women. The second one said, no, not only women, but he has women in positions, important positions, where others have usually just only men. So he promotes women, and women are kind of central in his work. And I was wondering, it's kind of strange, I've never heard about that. What I know is that Abramovich prefers to, or only employs people from a Jewish background for reasons of trust, but not anything specific about women. Then met the other one in between. Already the question they asked was what I think about Abramovich now having a new girlfriend who is not so much a bimbo or doll as the previous ones. They found in a Daily Mail article, she's got a Ukrainian surname, and there are millions in Russia, obviously, have a Ukrainian surname. And she wears a shirt that's kind of, that is a little bit, for a Western eye, a little bit maybe slightly punky. She's got a tattoo, and she's not the kind of cliche designer bag woman. Monsieur is that any such a little bit flamboyant, different fashion taste, but we see in a certain way that it might be kind of symbolizing some more progressive views is as a misunderstanding. It doesn't necessarily at all work for a Russian context. Then she runs a music website. He obviously is funding it, which was a bit kind of out of the mainstream, which they also read as something that Abramovich must be different. And they got the information that Abramovich supports a feminist organization in Ukraine. And that's apparently rubbish. And then the last one was that Abramovich supported films made by Serebrennikov. Serebrennikov, he was in Cannes last year, is a filmmaker whose movies are sometimes a little bit, how to call it, edgy, a bit different. And their view was that he does something he also got into jail for and was accused of tax evasion in Russia a few years ago. So they read it something very, very courageous of Abramovich that he dares to financially support a person like him. He also paid a medical treatment for Zyagintsev, another filmmaker. You might have seen his movie Leviathan a few years ago. It was screened here. I don't know what award it won. We're also convinced that there is no other, ask me whether there were any other oligarchs who does something similar, supporting this sort of what they saw as edgy and radical filmmakers. And finally, Abramovich for a long time, till in the early 2000s, did everything possible to have no photograph of him out there. There was big money put in tabloid journalism in Russia for the journalist who would manage to get a shot. That then stopped once he became governor in Chukotka. That was no longer possible, but nevertheless, a person who highly appreciated privacy and secrecy. Now he has partly moved to Istanbul. He wants to buy an Ottoman house preferably Bodrum. These Ottoman houses in Turkey are never on the market. So the only chance to ever have a chance to get one is when you're big in with the elites. He seems to be doing quite well. Every day the Turkish papers are writing about him, and there he is, a man of the people. If you go out in the morning in this district where he lives in Istanbul, you are very likely to say to at one point bump into Abramovich, and it's easy. You can always have a chat with him. He's the one who is always kind of funny, charming, making jokes with the waiters and waitresses. So a person is down to earth and a person very close to the people, which is quite a thing in terms of, I wonder how long it will take that we believe in this narrative. The PR team is absolute ingenious, that he will have this new image attached to him that we all believe in. Yesterday we had just a case. I met a friend and he said, well, Abramovich, he spoke out against the war. I said, interesting. When did he do that? So it even worked. He positioned himself in a way that he never said that he spoke out. He never spoke out against the war. And he never said anything that could not please the Kremlin. And he was very clever when he said at the beginning, I haven't met Putin for years. Well, obviously not. There was a pandemic. Putin was sitting in a bunker and allowed maybe 3 people into the bunker. Yeah, Abramovich probably was not among them, but it doesn't mean that Abramovich has not all kind of ways to get in touch with Putin. And he's certainly also one who is been always very, very, very close to Putin. And he put it in his clever way that he didn't lie, but it could be perceived from our science as something that he is distanced from him. Last word, Serebrennikov, just that, you know, Serebrennikov supporting him. That usually works also the music and the edgy things elsewhere and kind of feminist touch. The previous girlfriend he had after Dasha Zhukova, one of them, was a ballerina, and she had all kind of passions. And of course, then he would finance what she would ask him to support. This new girlfriend is in the music industry. Of course, he finances music industry. The feminism thing is kind of was like this. They did the absurdest thing possible, but it's very good if the rumors are out there. And the Serebrennikov story is also a bit of a problem in terms of Serebrennikov being a filmmaker, yes, edgy, but he knows exactly how far to go in terms of edginess. It was something Surkov, Putin's great cardinal, we say, kind of spin doctor, works out very well in the 2000s to give propaganda, Kremlin loyal cultural industry a certain edge that is completely Kremlin engineered and in control. Serebrennikov has been, maybe one can call it a court jester for 20 years at least, and is also kind of very close to all kind of big people, and not necessarily a radical filmmaker in terms of his whole persona. Dasha Zhukova.
Just to give you a sense of time, 5 more minutes.
Dasha Zhukova, formerly married to Abramovich, has 2 children with him. She still runs together with Abramovich the big art center in Moscow, Garage. And she also, of course, has a lot of financing with him. The children thing is particularly interesting because that's very close to what is now investigated, whether it's not actually a sanction evasion. She has all the doors open in New York's high society, and everybody, particularly there. And she's someone who actually doesn't need to do much herself in terms of reputation laundering or to keep her reputation intact. It's done by the New York high society. She apparently, in first days after the invasion, posted something on her Instagram platform accounts that was critical towards the war, and that's the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York is proven enough to certainly not ask her to step down as a trustee of the museum. And Winter also said something interesting in these terms of, after all, she's no longer attached to Abramovich's money, and she's already remarried, divorced and remarried, so there is no concern to be had. Well, the other things are not such important, or just maybe not aware to them. So it's quite a thing where one of these cases where once you don't have, and she's very eloquent, got no Russian accent, she's knows people through the garages, they always adored her, where all the kind of what they represent is what is kind of needed. And she supports us, she's an arts philanthropist, a lot of things in the arts, then you are redeemed a priori. And I think we will see a lot of that to come, especially we'll probably see a big role played by oligarch children who, because they were schooled in the West, are very likely to have such attributes. And when the attributes are raised, then it's easy to pass, especially if they do a little bit some symbolic thing that is understood as they are against the Kremlin, against the war, then that might well be enough. Those two haven't done just as well. This is Armine, who I spoke about, the one who whose art collection and him presenting it was a topic for documentaries 20 years ago already. His collection, there were plenty of exhibitions in the Royal Academy in all the big arts institutions in London, where what he lent to the exhibition was all over, of course, with name tag. He supported, what was it? He had already given, my memory, an art institution 10 million. He has already featured it in for expenses, and he gave it back. It was also interesting, so many institutions acted earlier than authorities did. So before even the government here could bring themselves to sanction people, they had already distanced themselves from the oligarchs. They try a lot in reputation management, and they're a little bit helpless. It goes from, you remember the cleaner and the driver. They try to get support from Russian people in the culture industry to be supported, with them confirming that they should not be on any sanction list, but so far it hasn't really worked out. Last words about the helpers, and in general what a problem is in sanction policies, and they're failing. Everything goes super slow. Reforms and legal reforms take ages. So, for example, the approach in the UK and the EU to extend sanctions to family members, it's a big thing. At the beginning, it was very, very clear the position. The sons can't be made responsible for the sins of their fathers, which, of course, by design is very problematic. It's only now, it took a whole year for the EU to finally try and get legal draft discussed seriously that should also includes the sanctioning of children. Another, of course, a big problem is the freezing, not the seizing. You end up with a yacht in a country and have to maintain it. It's basically Usmanov with his 600 million yachts is still the owner. He's just deprived of the rights to use the yacht. The yacht can't be turned into anything. It's just costs for the sanctioning taxpayer. Of course, it also means that the oligarchs can sue, which they've done. There have been about 50 court cases in the EU, and quite a few of them were successful. Another thing, of course, is also that freezing, seizing, confiscating oligarch assets is not something many want to do. Switzerland has started, in one case you wouldn't expect it, started doing so, nevertheless, and they've managed so far from the 150, what will it be, billion of Russian money in the country to seize 7% around that figure. Another problem many countries have legal conditions that only assets and accounts can be frozen or taken away from temporarily from oligarchs. They sanction, not however investment. So there's a big chunk that is not included. A lot of their money is obviously anyway offshore, and if there's not more transparency, difficult to trace. And finally, of course, there are also a lot of helpers in all kind of ways to slow down the process, act counter to it. I think that's the most important I want to say. I'm sure I've forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elisabeth, for your presentation. I'm going to open the floor to questions from the audience. Online attendees, if you can use the raise the hand function to pose your questions, or you may paste your question into the chat. Please state your name and affiliation where possible. Unless there's a burning question, I've got to. I'll use my position as chair to ask those questions. So, Elisabeth, I was thinking about, as you were talking, in terms of the relationship between inequality, conflict, and social cohesion. So I have two questions. One is, it's been talked about in the past year that Western governments, including the US and EU, have, either decided to sanction or not to sanction in various ways the oligarchs, with the hope / fantasy that they will turn on Vladimir Putin. So that's one, if you could comment on that. The second is, we talk, I know you work with Mike, and, and in his theme, they look a lot on this issue of the wealth tax. And I'm not, saying there's a wealth tax debate in Russia, but in what ways has Vladimir Putin kind of tapped into the funding of these oligarchs to A, fund the war effort? Is there research on that? And B, before the war, was he also kind of trying to tap into that funding to, fund, let's say, social welfare in order to maintain cohesion? Because when you have a country that's so unequal and you have people living in, sometimes in really dire situations, and then you have 110 or 88 billionaires, how does the state kind of tap into these resources, or does it?
I start with this one. You will have probably a reminder of what the first one was. So maybe it was very naive of me, but I thought, and there was also this thing that made me quite angry before the invasion, that if you sanctioned the oligarchs on a kind of a very large scale, then they might, the oligarchs are not very good in acting collectively, rivals that are, but nevertheless, there could have been a chance that they, for once, pull forces and get knock on Putin's door and tell him, if you go that far, we will no longer, we will take and deprive you of our support, which could have been important. And Putin's been in power for so long, among other things, because he's been seen as the only one who manages to balance out the most important elite groups and their interests. And the oligarchs certainly don't have the direct power over him, and much closer, of course, Shoigu, the defense minister, or the secret services. But nevertheless, Putin, to some extent, is on the better and kind of he's got a longer breath, but in the end, he also needs the oligarchs. There are, in many cases, employers of up to, even in some cases over 100,000 people, and one of the biggest fear is Putin is social unrest, and often they're in monotowns, so the biggest employers. And if Deripaska, for example, says goodbye, then there is a big problem in this very place. Also, what kind of was, and then remember the first days, especially secret services, the closest people to Putin and defense industry and others, they are very likely to Lavrov as foreign minister to be so under control that it's difficult for them to plot a coup, a palace coup against Putin. But the oligarchs could have, because they have had with a certain distance, if they acted collectively, they could have maybe arranged for me in the dream world. So maybe it's naive of me having had the thought that it could have happened. Had it happened, kind of having the sanctions drop in, they of course all were running for the individual solutions, and many of them then circling around Putin, trying to find a kind of a safe way out. They were hating it to be stuck in Russia. They still have good lives sitting around in Dubai or wherever. But it's their whole system as with this oligarchy, but they never bothered about promoting rule of law or anything, because they always had London to fly to for any litigation issues. With all the courts in Russia completely at Putin's mercy. And then they can't even usually could have just, if it got a bad situation, jumped into their private jets and fly over to London, which having limits and restrictions in the terms, very difficult to them. I remember what you said, one thing about how guilty they are, or how involved they were and how directly they involved in the war. It's a tricky one, but some obviously do, listen. And yeah, he's not even in the media, that also shocked me. There's very, very little to find. They can find journalists haven't taken that up and said, well, there's a scandal, we should sanction the guy. But the most, of course, not necessarily. But I'm not sure to what extent that is the most important. There's some oligarchs who are whining and whinging because after all, they've never had any dealings with Putin. Once you have a business and once you own a few billions, sometimes you just also be 1 billion, it's impossible in Russia that you haven't done so without cultivating good relationships with the Kremlin. It's difficult to do otherwise, which they weren't so opposed, whatever they thought, because Russia is the place where you can so much more easily make money than any of them would have ever managed elsewhere. So it's not a question when some are whining oh, but I mean, I even give money to the opposition, and I've done so for years. Yeah, but nevertheless, you're playing the game. Whether you get the money from, of course, it's Russia, and that also implies playing along with the game. In terms of them, social welfare infrastructure support, they've done it for years. Of course, they stepped in whatever called to step in, but in many cases also that they did their own things that were right in order not to be imposed a project by the Kremlin. Vexelberg got what was called the Silicon Valley in Russia, was the Moscow Silicon Valley equivalent. You know, You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
Wechselberg, the oligarch, got it imposed on him, and he got depressed. He was hating it. So before, yeah. There's a hand up. Or
Thank you. There's no questions online, so any questions in the room?
what? Paul?
Hi, Elisabeth. Thank you. I have a series of questions. The first question is like, what do we know about how those lists are constructed? I mean, what do you need to do or to be on the list? Does it vary from one jurisdiction to another? Or is there a perfect overlap between the sanction that we observe in the US or in the EU? That's my first question. And my second question is like, according to you, I mean, I know that's very difficult to answer because we don't have any counterfactual, but like, what are the objectives of those sanctions actually? I mean, and how do you assess to which extent those who put in place those kind of sanctions attain their objectives, or is it just not possible to measure it? And so one question is like, so on the, how do you construct those lists of sanctions that sanction people? Do we observe violations from one jurisdiction to another? And the last question, which is like, what's the purpose and how do we assess the efficacy of those sanctions?
Yeah, the sanctions, of course, they're compiled very differently from place to place. In the EU, and the problem is that every EU member has right to veto. That was the case. It was funny at the beginning. There was the first draft list was leaked and had Deripaska on it. Deripaska is a very close friend of our Austrian former Chancellor Schimpfössl, and so there was assumption that his name then in the final list had gone, that Austria said yes. So that's a very, very tricky thing in the terms. The EU also has, of course, with several people, concern in terms of given the dependence it has on Russian products like steel, that those people fall off more easily. The UK was quite it first was very reluctant trying to save their own oligarchs here. With them, they are very close friends, of course, here the establishment. Then, however, they sped up and even over the moment and overtaking the EU. In the US, I would love to be a fly in the wall in, when they're compiling the lists. There also in so many cases, also in the UK, I was wondering how on earth there's so many missing from the top 20, and they take some random names from God knows how of the end of the Forbes list. So in many cases, of course, I have the same question. In the US, one person, so it's kind of, you go through a list, and if some big name lobbyist has reservations about a name, then they just cross it out. So it's basically corporate interests. It's basically an oligarchy. You can imagine what is an oligarchic decision making? Political elites, lawmakers take the decision, and that's of course simplified, and big business having a big say in it. The sanctions haven't. You can of course assess how effective sanctions are in terms of what's happening, and they have had zero effect. And they're completely good for nothing, which doesn't mean that they shouldn't exist. I'm completely, I absolutely believe that they should actually have been widened much more. Exactly, given the role of this complicity of making big money in Russia, and playing along, and also it makes, of course, makes you complicit. And they are now whining, whinging, but they've never ever had any much dealings. Kind of, you can't imagine how many oligarchs claim they haven't had much dealings with the Kremlin. Well, it is question, well, you could have found, you had about dozens, hundreds of chances in the last 10, 20 years to speak up and say a word against the authoritarianism that's got stronger and stronger in the country. So that in that way, of course, makes you guilty. In terms of the effectiveness, absolutely zero.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank you, Elisabeth, for joining us today. It's been a pleasure for me to chair today's event. Thank you for our audience in the room and also online. And until next time, thank you and goodbye online and in person. So, thank you.